Hello, and welcome to the Springboard Podcast. I'm your host, Steven Springer, and I'm excited to share this journey with you guys. First off, you're probably wondering who is Steven Springer and why are you doing a podcast? Sometimes I often wonder that myself. But this is definitely something that's been, in the works for a little bit. Part coping mechanism, but also part something that I really believe in. And I think the best way to introduce this podcast and myself is maybe a little bit of a story of why this type of podcast works and introduce you guys to the mission a little bit. In my life, I definitely see a challenge where folks don't want to have conversations or maybe avoid conversations that maybe are a little bit uncomfortable or ones that we don't know enough about or don't want to ruffle the feathers. And something that I think is important is, we're not going to be experts on all topics and we're not going to know everything. But part of the important thing about, being human and being in community with each other is being able to share thoughts and be able to grow. And I think a good example of a good story that I have in terms of why this podcast is important and what to expect. It was a couple years ago. I was at a bar in LA and was with some friends watching a game. It might have been like the NBA finals or something, but not important. But was hanging around afterwards, and some folks had left, and I think somebody was at the bar closing out, and someone was coming in trying to sit and taking up the space, and we're watching TV, and can't remember what was on the screen, but something about trans or someone that was trans maybe was on the screen, or maybe that was kind of the political topic or the sport kind of conversation that was happening. And this person was kind of disgusted by this. And I'm thinking to myself, I I'm I'm not an expert in this. I also don't want to have this conversation. I'm trying to go home. It's late. But I thought to myself, well, I don't like the rhetoric that's happening in the world today. And I decided to have a conversation with this person and try to share perspective of what maybe someone that is trans is going through and how, all the commentary and things that are happening in the world are, creating this environment that's pretty hard, even if you are, having challenges with your gender identity and being able to, figure out the spaces that you're trying to live in. That journey alone is hard enough, but now you have, the rhetoric that's saying, you know, this is terrible, you need to go back, you're an abomination, and tried to find empathy. And I think that's something that I was trying to share to this person. And after the conversation, I wasn't trying to correct him or, make him see my point of view. Um, I just wanted to be able to share a different perspective. And it was interesting afterwards, he kind of responded back to me saying, well, thank you. I thought I was going to get canceled and really didn't want to have the conversation. And I'm glad I didn't think about it that way. So I don't think he changed his opinion by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly appreciative of that. And it kind of dawned on me, like, what is that balance of being able to talk about topics that maybe we don't know or aren't 100% familiar with, but also able to kind of engage in discourse with different folks. So I think that's honestly what's missing. Now, it's not to go ahead and say, we need to educate and coddle to every kind of wrong perspective or, being able to do the learning for that person. But I think it's important that we are able to have a conversation, not to be right, but to seek understanding and to be able to actually grow. If we aren't able to do that, then what are we doing here? These are important conversations to have, and I hopefully my goal is that I can provide a little bit of perspective, grounding in just some context of things that are happening kind of in the world, share some kind of thoughts and opinions around kind of, how I'm feeling and where I'm thinking about it. But ultimately, I'm not going to be the one that's doing all the work, nor am I going to be the one that is the expert on any of the subjects that I'm talking about. But I do want this to be a catalyst to maybe wade into some of the deeper waters in your own pools and being able to actually have these conversations, whether it be at the dinner table with friends, and not letting it sit on the sidelines because we're in a very, very rapidly changing world. And being able to talk and engage might be the only thing that keeps us all together. With that being said, I want to jump into the first topic for this episode, and that's on the executive orders coming out from our new president, President Donald Trump. Um, Certainly a wave of action here in the first week of his second presidency, and not short of the promises that he delivered on the campaign trail, but also a lot of these executive orders are quite concerning in terms of what's going on and what the content are. Now, to be clear, I want to start with a grounding on executive orders, in my understanding. Executive orders are pretty common. They've been used all the way back from the time of George Washington. The president is responsible for the operations of the federal government. So think about Donald Trump as the CEO of the federal government. And so with that, you're able to provide directives that are able to actually kind of help get things done quickly or guide the different agencies or even go around Congress and where maybe it's a little bit slower or push some of the agendas forward. These in the past, these executive orders have been the Emancipation Proclamation, the starting of the Peace Corps. It's also been used in some pretty controversial topics, whether it be the Manhattan Project or the internment camps of the Japanese citizens in during World War II. So certainly a broad spectrum of how these are used, but I think very concerning how Donald Trump has been using the executive orders to date. And there's been a large number of them, but the couple I want to highlight are, and I'll start with the birthright citizenship. And this is one where the title of it is Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship. And this order essentially is defining and the birthright citizenship to say that the mother or father has to be a legal citizen in order for a new child born, to be guaranteed the right to be an American citizen. Um, Certainly a very stark change because one of the limitations of executive orders are that you can't break establishing law and you certainly can't circumvent the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment of the Constitution states that any child born in the United States and not subject to any other jurisdictions is is an American citizen. And one of the reasons why this was kind of ratified and put into place was after the emancipation and, when slaves were free, one of the things to limit the rights of these new citizens of the new America was to prevent any descendants of slaves were not allowed to be American citizens and weren't considered American citizens. So the 14th Amendment and the following Dobbs case that was able to had a Supreme Court decision that confirmed it, then said that any citizen born, any child born in the United States has a birthright of citizenship. I'll start with I think the idea of birthright citizenship is one worth a conversation. When you think about how you become a citizen, if you are here illegally, to then have children and automatically be granted citizen status, you could say that, well, like, what is to stop people from, going on vacation and, essentially, vacation and birthing a child to essentially guarantee citizenship in that country of birth? Um, there's other countries. It's not a global thing. I would say it's more common in this side of the world, the Americas. And if you go to look at like England, for example, it's a parent or grandparent has to be a citizen. Some are different descendants. Some are born. You have to be born and have relatives that are citizens of that country. So it's definitely a little bit unique to the states. We already made that decision in the 14th Amendment that says if you are born in the United States, no matter your parentage, you are granted American citizenship. So for Donald Trump to put this executive order in place and essentially circumvent the Constitution is terrible policy and very concerning given that we have Supreme Court precedent and constitutional amendments that are saying that you are guaranteed this right, and certainly a stark change in trying to kind of control the population. And I think they'll say it's in the guise of trying to limit immigration. I question if that's truly the intent or if there's maybe some ulterior motives. But again, I think the most concerning thing, besides just what it does and who specifically this is targeting, the fact that it's an order that's actively trying to circumvent the United States Constitution is very, very, very concerning. The other executive order that I wanted to talk about was the executive order that essentially rolled back diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I want to get the language right. Ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. And it's interesting because this is essentially trying to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within the federal government. What's concerning about this is diversity, equity, and inclusion as a principle is literally about trying to create opportunities and create equity that allows all people to have the opportunity to be considered on their merits. And I'll give an example from when I was president of the Scott's Black Employee Group. What we did there was when I noticed the hiring trend where we would go and recruit at the same lap of schools. It was Ohio State, it was Indiana University, Miami University, maybe a Notre Dame every now and then. But outside of going to those schools, there wasn't really any other recruitment from different talent pools. And one of the things that was important was there is an actual conference called the National Black MBA Conference. That's a gathering of MBA students and also undergraduates, and where companies can come in and recruit, see resumes, and that was an opportunity to diversify the applicant pool. We also started making contact and relationships and building those relationships with HBCUs in order to make sure that we had a pipeline. Now, that wasn't guaranteeing or hitting a certain number of applicants or hires. What it was trying to make sure that as we were growing our talent pool and trying to hit different goals and business metrics relative to sales performance, we wanted to make sure that we were finding talent wherever they may lie. And that's a critical aspect of DEI that I think is concerning. It's being weaponized to try to eliminate thinking that, oh, it's just trying to get Black people into jobs they shouldn't be in, and the only reason why they be qualified is because of the color of their skin. And it's disenfranchising Americans, which essentially white males, that are maybe being overlooked. And instead of looking at their own merits as maybe a challenge, it's no, well, it must be the DEI hires that are reasons why these jobs aren't happening. So certainly very concerning, especially given how much is being rolled back. Even some executive orders that were signed around the Civil Rights Act, those are actually getting overturned as well. So it's not just dismantling DEI in the federal government, but also dismantling some of the foundational civil rights movement and acts and privileges and opportunities that have been created, and ignoring the fact that things like redlining and actively not hiring people based on the color of their skin, like those things, or their sex. I don't want to just make it black, women as well, like LGBTQ. Like these things are important to be able to have access and make sure that people are being considered for the merits. And the idea that this is just the way to meet quotas and we're just hiring people for the sake of hiring people. Tell me what organization would pay someone that's not qualified to do the job. It just simply does not make sense. The other thing that I think is concerning is, one, it doesn't count for veterans and disabled people. So if you're considered based on your LGBTQ status, your race, your religion, your gender, those are dismantled. But if you're a veteran or if you're disabled, those are still protected, and that's okay to be under the federal program. So why is some equitable solutions and programs okay, but are those are okay because those protect merit, but if you consider race, gender, religion, sexuality, those are all of a sudden not included? It doesn't make any sense. The other challenge is the executive orders are limited to the federal government. But one of the key pieces of language in this executive order actually tries to uh, direct the federal agencies to look at the private sector. Each agency has to identify 9 private sector companies, and also large enough, I think it was over $500 million of revenue, to then investigate them and see what type of DEI programs or maybe potential violations to this executive order are they accusing, and make, and then an action plan of trying to essentially bully the private sector into dismantling DEI programs. So again, one of the big challenge here, not only are you just eroding civil rights that have been established since 1965, and I mean, it took a long time to get there, and we have a long way to go in terms of equity in this country, but you're also now weaponizing the federal government to attack private citizens and private entities. And that's beyond the scope of the federal government, but also, Trump and the Republican base is all about limited government and, not overreaching. And now we're going after the private sector. The third executive order that I wanted to talk about is it's a gender definition order. And this is defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biology truth. Now, that's quite a mouthful and loaded in terms of its language, just in the headline. But what this executive order seeks to do is, instead of talking about gender and gender identity, the only conversation is going to be about sex and biological sex. And that biological sex is defined as male and female. Certainly one of the biggest campaign stories, and clearly has resonated with the base. But I mean, I remember when I was back in Ohio visiting my family, and just the amount of ads that were focused on trans rights and the medical procedures and things like that, just fear mongering for such a small part of the population, or protecting women's sports. Clearly resonate with the base, so much so that now any talk or any conversations around gender ideology, any type of kind of, are you sex moving it, or, that identity of maybe you were born male but identify as female, identify as non-binary, all of that now, as from a federal government perspective, is essentially canceled. So bathrooms have to be male or female. Passports and federal documents all have to say male or female. There is no other option for, kind of X or non-binary, which I think is interesting because, well, one, globally, that's still the case where countries have chosen to be inclusive and recognize gender identity on their federal and legal documents. But the other thing that's a challenge too is, if, say, you are transitioning, or you are, on that kind of on that journey, if you now have to have a document that says I'm male, but maybe you are transitioning or have already transitioned, now you're essentially outing yourself, or having to reveal something that's personal to anybody. And you're also now having to, how do you validate that? Are we now going to be checking and inspecting folks to ensure their certificates and different documentation are correct? But also it's removing that autonomy from our bodies, which is very concerning. But we've seen that happen from the last Congress and Senate, where that was happening from women's rights perspective. But the other thing, that's reducing protection. So that will make it challenging if you need health care, if you need certain medicines to go through the transition, or, gender affirming care. But then the other thing that's hard too is, well, what happens if you get sick, or you need to have coverage from Medicare, or, are you not going to be able to have access to those things? Are you not going to be protected from that perspective? If you're getting harassed or discriminated against, that's not recognized. So you're essentially disenfranchising the whole population, that like they no longer have protections under federal law. Again, further violating the civil rights, and it's incredible how you're kind of creating this enemy and creating this common enemy to rally around. It's a tactic used throughout history, but the fact that you're kind of creating these common enemies around trans, which I think there's maybe like one, I think I've had the stat, it was like about 1 million trans folks that are out, or that are documented, like that. We have US populations over 320 million people. Like, why we're doing all this work for such a small subset of our country? But I want to transition here and just kind of think about just what that means and some of the implications going forward. I think from a citizen's perspective, it's very concerning. I mean, you're seeing the erosion of civil rights. You're seeing a president willingly go around Constitution and Supreme Court rulings. And these weren't the only three executive orders. There was executive orders essentially rescinding everything that Trump, or that Biden did. Also, we're seeing executive orders that are, creating an emergency crisis at the border, and rolling back EV policies, and trying to take away funding from things, and essentially enabling ICE to start to execute against mass deportations. These are very concerning, and you're starting to really redefine American society, but not necessarily an image that everybody agrees upon. And also very much kind of circumventing the normal process where it is democratic, that is through votes, through Congress, through the Senate. The other thing that is concerning is just the amount of power that the executive branch is trying to take over. I mean, it's very much Project 2025, and if anybody was thinking that wasn't going to happen, here's your wake up call. But to try to wield that much power in the executive branch and circumvent the other branches of government, certainly very concerning, and one that we want to pay attention to. You saw, the January 6th folks get, by executive order, get pardoned. So there's no repercussions for, crimes and certain crimes, if as long as you're aligned with Trump. But also then just the ability to kind of use and wield power, and try to enforce the will of the president, of one person. That's certainly not a democracy. That's very much a king, royalty at this point. It's a monarchy. And then, the other thing is just the American and the global stage. I think, we've liked to talk about how America is the leader, setting the example across the country, or sorry, across the world. But when you start to have these policies that are reductive in terms of, leadership of where society is going as a whole, it's only going to be concerning, and diminish our influence and our leadership across the board. I mean, even leaving the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Agreements, I mean, the world is going to leave us behind, if this type of rhetoric and this kind of policy is going to continue. But I encourage you to, do the work, continue to stay vigilant, and look at what's happening. I know it's a lot. I try not to stay on social media because it can be disheartening at times, but it's important to pay attention and keep a pulse on that, because I don't think it's done. Talking about staying vigilant, I want to transition to something that's a little bit personal, just given kind of where I live and some of the things I've experienced in my life. And that was the recent LA fires here, both the Palisades fire as well as the Eaton fire and a couple others. I mean, these fires burned over almost over 50,000 acres. I think we're at 29 fatalities at the last count. 16,000 structures, well over $250 billion worth of damage. Certainly very scary. I had to evacuate my home with my partner, but luckily the fires didn't reach our apartment. I'm still able to, um, you know, record and also, was lucky enough not to lose anything. But actually 3 years ago, I did have a house fire in an apartment and did lose a lot of things. And, as this was unfolding, it was certainly traumatizing. The body certainly doesn't forget. But also the recovery that it took just for, one apartment, and that experience, it was a long recovery in terms of it took a month to find a new place, stayed in a hotel for a month, but then also just even the landlord trying to rebuild that apartment. I think driving by it, it was well like a year and a half between permits, and I'm sure it wasn't cheap trying to rebuild. That's terrible. And so when I see, being from Ohio, I'm not used to having fires, and also the fact that these wildfires were burning in the city, certainly very scary. And I remember just looking at the Watch Duty app and looking at the flight radar of like where helicopters and planes were dropping, as well as the news to try to see which helicopters were looking where, and if the planes were having good passes to try to put out the fire and fight it. It was incredible. And the devastation that you see across these areas is heartbreaking. People's homes and livelihoods and memories. And I think that was one thing when I had my experiences. People were like, well, at least you got out. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. Like, did get out, very safe, and was fortunate. But when you lose those memories, when you are displaced, it's very difficult. But one of the most concerning things throughout this process was how much misinformation and the opportunity to weaponize a tragic event, um, for the sake of political gain or political attacks, was incredibly concerning. One was around the we ran out of water and if we had enough water that we were able to put out the fires. I just want to put perspective. I had a house fire. It was a two-story kind of like townhome looking place, and the LAFD came in with three different trucks, ladders going up, people inside, attacking it from all angles for one townhouse. We just said 16,000 structures burned across all these fires. The amount of water drawn by all these resources that are in place, and the scale of the response from the firefighters fighting a fire that is growing rapidly, fighting the winds that were. I mean, I remember in my apartment, like that night when the fire first started, I was more worried about the winds blowing the windows out, let alone the fires that were happening. And this idea that we ran out of water, well, the water pressure ran low because we were using so much because it was unprecedented fire. But to say that it was mismanagement from Newsom and protecting a smelt fish, no, like that wasn't the issue. The reservoirs were full, water was being used. It was truly unprecedented. The other thing that's concerning was just some of the rhetoric around the diverse leaders that we have, in both our mayor as well as in the fire department. So the LAFD, or the head of the LA Fire, she's actually a woman who is, out, so she's a gay woman. And then the mayor, Karen Bass, she's a black woman. And the conversations around them was, well, the Karen Bass was responsible for cutting the budget, and it was cut by $17 million, and it was underfunded. And had there been enough funding, the fires would have been put out. Well, digging a little bit deeper, that funding, the $17 million was relative to one-off expenses, so different dozers and things like that. So those line items, once you buy a piece of equipment like that, you don't buy it every year. And actually, when you look at the funding now, there was actually a significant increase in the funding for the fire department. But that story was mismanagement, incompetence, like calling for her to resign over this. And then same with the response for our fire chief, the fact that she's a gay woman somehow made her unqualified to do the job. She was too weak. She didn't prepare the team. She's the fire chief for a reason. Like, you don't just all of a sudden become that. Like, I couldn't become fire chief tomorrow. Like, you have to earn that, and you have to have the respect of the people that you manage to do something that you're literally putting your lives at risk every day. And the fact that you have this emergency response and you have this rhetoric happening is extremely concerning. And a step further, you have folks in Congress actually saying we're going to withhold FEMA funding and federal funding to help recovery until you change some of your ways and your laws that are in place. And the fact that you're going to have conditional aid from the government is incredibly concerning. You can't use these tools in politics. People are suffering. People lost everything. People died, and we're going to try to create this as a political event. Incredibly concerning, and one that I worry, and it's hard, right? Because a lot of information is coming out quickly, and it's hard to discern what's going on. But I challenge folks to, make sure you're doing the due diligence. Maybe take a step further instead of just reading the headlines, because it's only going to continue. So with that, those are the topics I wanted to cover for today. Hopefully, you guys had a good swim. But I encourage you. This is meant to be the starting point. So I encourage you to continue to have these conversations, do some more research, certainly engage with the podcast, and continue to learn, because we have to be able to have these conversations, whether you're an expert or not. To ignore the problem is complying and is complicit in what's going on in our society. So with that, I'll ask you to subscribe on Instagram, it's Springboard Podcast on Instagram. But also, I want this to be a community. So if there's topics you want to cover or see talk about, drop an email at thespringboardpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you guys for listening. I really appreciate sharing this journey with me, and I look forward to the next episode.